On March 27, 1995, Jack Nicholson took the stage to present an honorary Oscar to legendary filmmaker Michelangelo Antonioni.
Most movies celebrate the ways we connect with one another. The films of this master mourn the failures to connect. In the empty, silent spaces of the world, he has found metaphors that illuminate the silent places of our hearts, and found in them, too, a strange and terrible beauty.
The experience of standing on the Oscar stage that night was undoubtedly more celebratory than his previous visit to Los Angeles 27 years earlier, when the maestro began shooting his first and last American feature.
Zabriskie Point, a remote and barren blister of land in the American desert, as isolated as the face of the moon.
By the time the film was released nearly 2 years later, on February 9th, 1970, it left in its wake a run of bad press, FBI scrutiny over its production, and a studio that wanted it dumped and forgotten.
I don't think he quite understood what making a movie for MGM was going to be like until it was too late.
The truly great films from this period of American cinema are inseparable from the European influences that preceded them. Fellini, Godard, Bergman, Truffaut. These are just a few of the masters that challenged traditional narrative with great elation and authority. Michelangelo Antonioni was one of the most consequential of these filmmakers. In his hands, the principal tenets that informed the common perception of what a film was, dialogue, characters, plot, played second fiddle to the environment in which they were housed. Film critic and author of the films of Michelangelo Antonioni, Peter Brunet.
This is what people don't understand. They think when a character is feeling emotion, or the director wants you, the spectator, to experience an emotion, what you need to do is zoom in for the close-up. Get that tear going down that cheek, and then that's how you show emotion. What I think Antonioni knew, and what those who have followed him, and there are plenty of directors I could name, Wong Kar-wai, whom I also wrote a book on, says that Antonioni is his greatest favorite, absolute favorite director. What they understand is that you can often express more emotion by pulling the camera back as far as possible and letting the entire frame speak emotionally, sort of the way abstract painting works. You feel an emotion because of the shapes and the colors and the emptiness. It's not because you've zoomed in on somebody crying.
Distinguished Professor of Film Studies at Oregon State University, John Lewis.
If you think about La Ventura, which is the film that sort of established Antonioni as a kind of important director, it begins on this sort of on this island where they lose a character, who never returns in the film. And the very last scene of that movie is this moment where she maybe forgives her lover, who's sort of been inconsistent the whole movie and is the lover of the woman who disappeared. And he finds this sort of amazing ruin, and they're sort of sitting on this sort of platform on this ruin, and you can see mountains in the background. And it's clear that the problems of these two insignificant people are far less interesting to him than the landscape that they occupy.
The genesis of Zabriskie Point lies in the global success of Antonioni's previous and perhaps most accessible film, Blow Up.
What are you doing? Stop it! Stop it! Give me those pictures. You can't photograph people like that.
Who says I can't? I'm only doing my job. Some people are bullfighters, some people are politicians. I'm a photographer.
The contract that led to the making of Zabriskie Point began when MGM contracted to get U.S. distribution rights to Blow Up in 1966. And they entered into a 3-picture deal with Antonioni. One, because they were pretty sure that Blow Up was going to be a hit, which it was, And then they were hoping he'd make a kind of hip American film that might get young people back into the habit of going to the movies again. What I think the executives who saw that film didn't know or didn't bother to find out was that film was really not like any of his previous stuff. And because it had sort of a central plot line, it was a thriller. It even had, an elevator pitch. A photographer accidentally captures a crime, and then those who committed the crime try to get the negative so that the proof is gone. And so it's sort of Hitchcockian. And they figured, we'll get him to shoot an American thriller that's really hip, And he was telling MGM all along, I'm going to make this counterculture film. And they were saying, yes, sure. And they were thinking, they being MGM, were thinking he was going to make, The Wild Angels or Easy Rider, and he wasn't going to do that. He was never going to do that. And, it is kind of funny. There were never, what is it? There was never a meeting of the minds on this at all. So the first thing he did when he was going to make Zabriskie Point was he sort of took a road trip, and he fell in love with the desert. And he said, this landscape doesn't exist in Europe. There's nothing like this. And it's this sort of vast emptiness, a 2-hour drive out of Los Angeles. And that became, in a lot of ways, the kind of centerpiece of the movie, this idea of a road trip to nowhere. There's something very spiritual about that emptiness, and he felt that somehow spoke to the sort of seeking of youth in the 1960s.
It's interesting to me that he brought on a variety of writers, starting with Sam Shepard.
Shepard didn't actually do anything except write the treatment. So when he went to tell MGM what he was doing, he being Antonioni, he had in hand a kind of scenario written by Shepard that was about real estate development in the desert Southwest. And that was about it, and that was all Shepard did. And I don't know what was in Antonioni's mind, but certainly looking at the movie, it doesn't look like he was ever making that. But that's what he told MGM he was doing. So, and then the other writers, one was his girlfriend, Claire Peplow. One was Tonino Guerra. Tonino Guerra was the screenwriter he had worked with before. It may be fair to guess that's actually who wrote the script.
Antonioni's vision of the America of that time contrasts the cluttered, billboard-strewn streets of L.A. and the desert wasteland of Zabriskie Point, which holds the distinction of being the lowest point in the United States. Along the way, we are witness to violent student protests, vulgar representations of commercialization, and the budding romance of a beautiful young couple, Mark and Daria, played by non-actors who are not so incidentally named, Mark Frechette and Daria Halprin.
And he was shooting it kind of like a neo-realist film because the two actors were not professionals, the two lead actors, and he was playing off of that kind of Italian neo-realist thing where you get a kind of true realism by working with non-professionals who just sort of act in, maybe are more reacting than acting in certain scenarios.
Associate Professor of Cinema Studies at Kadir Has University in Istanbul, Turkey, Melis Behlil.
And the fact that the lead actors are not professionals, and he just chose people who were around there, the young people of the time, neither of whom went on to make many other films, but they're not really great actors. I mean, they're not actors to begin with, but that, I think, again, has to do with a strategy on Antonioni's part to keep us at a distance, which is his classical cinema. I mean, there are scenes in his other films where we don't even hear the characters' conversations. That's how much of a distance he puts between his audience and his characters. And he does it here with these two characters who we don't necessarily relate to, but they're beautiful to look at too. They're both, gorgeous people, very energized, even though they might not have a goal in life and they might not know what they're doing necessarily. They're sort of driving around. And I think that sort of works within Antonioni's general style. But of course, the fact that they are quite, I don't necessarily want to say typically American looking, because what is that? But they're very movie star looking people. Mm-hmm. So I think that sort of helps us watch the film in a way.
I mean, the pigs are on the campus now. Next, where do you want them? Sitting up in the classroom? You want them in your door? You want them standing on the street every time you walk out? You have to wait to get to that to be revolutionary. Now, what we're saying is this school is going to close down, period. There ain't nobody coming in this school unless they come at their own risk. And once they decide they want their school back open, they're going to open it on our terms, period.
Why stop the students that want to go? I mean...
Because they're in our way. Because they prevent us from getting what we deserve. We have tried all other means. We've negotiated, we've pleaded, we've written programs, we've done this. We haven't got anything.
To figure out what was going on with the counterculture, he went to college campuses and talked to, campus radicals, real life for real campus radicals. And then, as an advisor on the film, he got Kathleen Cleaver, who was married to Eldridge Cleaver, who was the Black Panther who was living in exile in Tunisia at the time because he was one of America's 10 most wanted. And Kathleen Cleaver was in the Black Panthers herself and was someone that the FBI was sort of routinely following around. So he's making a movie, and an on-set advisor is somebody that the FBI is tracking. And that was the beginning of a lot of things that went wrong with the film, and a lot of things that got MGM very nervous about this new contract with this Italian director.
The studio's apprehension didn't stop there. The centerpiece of the film, a lovemaking scene between Mark and Daria, which soon transforms into an all-out orgy of naked, twisted flesh in the sand dunes of the desert, was a particular point of contention.
The film it didn't get a rating, so it was rated X. And because of that scene, Antonioni contracted with this Joseph Chaikin's theater group, who are an avant-garde theater group, and they did a lot of performances where there was no dialogue and it was just movement. So he contracted with them to come out to the desert to shoot this scene where he would have all these bodies sort of rolling in the sand, and it would be kind of the centerpiece of the film, and it was infamously called the loving scene. And it became more and more grandiose, so eventually just having that theater group wasn't going to be enough. He needed more people, so then they were bringing in extras. And the studio initially sort of sat back while the park rangers at Death Valley National Park were objecting to the scene, and they said they wouldn't permit it to be shot there, and the studio didn't intercede. They didn't try to smooth things over. They were hoping, okay, this will just go away, and then maybe we'll get an R-rated movie. And it didn't go away, and he got to shoot the scene, and it's pretty amazing to look at, and it would probably be beyond an R today as well. Mm. And the studio eventually had to give in because they were stuck throwing money and supporting the project. They actually shipped in different sand. So they're in, the sand dunes at Death Valley Park, and they brought in smoother sand because the actors and extras were complaining that the sand was too coarse for them to roll around naked in. Yeah, I know. It's sort of funny. So the studio actually had to do this crazy logistical thing just to support a scene they hated and they never wanted in the movie. And then after the movie was complete, there was in the California State Court an action involving the Mann Act, which is a 1910 law about basically to combat white slavery, which is the taking across state lines of minors for illicit purposes. And so that was sort of another headache that Antonioni kind of couldn't believe that he might be involved in some sort of human trafficking case for trying to shoot a movie scene with a bunch of naked people not actually having sex, but making believe that they're having sex.
So that's quite a story.
Well, it's quite a story, and it was just yet another headache for him and for MGM. And in fact, he left the country to finish work on the movie because of it. And it didn't really go away clearly until over a decade later, when there's a case called California v. Freeman. I mean, this is a little obscure, but it was a court case that basically said that performing in an erotic film, either real sex acts or simulated sex acts, could not be deemed prostitution. And so it wasn't until a 1980s case that this whole question of taking people across state lines to perform in a movie in which there's an erotic scene might be deemed an illegal act. And for an Italian, I'm sure it just seemed like, wow, that's quintessentially American, this kind of idiotic Puritanism.
Before Zabriskie Point reached theaters, its curious and troubled production made it a notorious property. And in the midst of its eventual release, it didn't help that its two leading actors spoke less than admirably about the film and its director on the widely watched Dick Cavett show.
You're not recommending your own film?
I'm not.
That's certainly a relief on a show, isn't it, to have someone come on and non-plug their film?
No, I don't want to non-plug it. I just said there's a lot in it that I was disappointed in. Yeah. And there's a lot that was attempted that wasn't achieved.
Following the ill-fated release of the film, Mark and Daria carried on a real-life relationship and moved into a commune together. Following the dissolution of that relationship, Daria went on to marry Dennis Hopper, and today she enjoys a career in arts education and therapy. Mark's fate was far less enchanting. After participating in a botched armed robbery, he was sent to prison for as many as 15 years. Not long into his sentence, he was killed in a freakish weightlifting accident.
The film basically sits for a year, and then they show it in a handful of theaters and just let it disappear. And it gets killed by the critics, which doesn't help, or didn't help, critics who had so embraced Antonioni's earlier films, which frankly are similar in a lot of ways. Did they hate Zabriskie Point, and so it became impossible in the end for MGM to promote it, because they couldn't promote it as a kind of fun teen picture, because it's sure not that, and then they couldn't promote it as an art film because the critics said it was bad.
Do you think some of that was kind of the gall of this guy to come over to our shores and try to tell us what we are?
Yeah. And I think there was definitely, the studios just didn't know how to play the counterculture. They wanted a counterculture film that in the end, the counterculture characters become part of the establishment. So, the counterculture is just a fad. And here's a movie saying, no, the kids aren't all right. And the distance between the establishment and this new generation is vast and impossible to bridge.